Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about Baroque and Rococo art. Baroque art comes right after the Renaissance in Italy. It's not like the Renaissance ended and then Baroque art began, but there was a shift in style and in theme that changed from the Renaissance to Baroque. So it's not like a certain date when the time changed, but we think of Baroque art as being from around 1600 to 1700. And then we're going to talk a little bit about Rococo art, which is during the 1700s in France. I do want to give a trigger warning for this video. Some of the topics and themes that we're going to discuss and the images we're going to look at are not pleasant. We're going to be talking about sexual assault and rape and pedophilia. I know these are not pleasant topics, but I don't want to present this artwork and this time period without telling you more about what was going on with the artists and what the artwork is about. We're going to start with this sculpture here called The Rape of the Sabines. And this is a sculpture by a man named Bologna. His goal in this was to try to make one sculpture that had three figures that was taller than the David. He wanted to out David the David, to show like I could do better than Michelangelo. So this sculpture is actually just a little bit taller than the David. Her finger here at the top just goes like 1 inch above the David's head. But what's being depicted here is this man in the middle is a Roman soldier, and this is a Sabine man, and here at the top we have a Sabine woman. So the story goes that the Romans, they started out as a country of soldiers. They started out as an army, and the problem with them all being soldiers, a nation of soldiers, is that they were all men. They had way too many men and no women. So they realized, oh, we're all going to get old. We're going to die. There's not going to be a Roman country. There's not going to be Romans anymore. So they decided they needed to find wives. And so they asked the neighboring tribe, the neighboring group of people called the Sabines, if they could marry their women. And the Sabine men said no, because women were property. And so what they did is they invited the Sabines to come to Rome to have a big party, a festival for the two nations to come together and spend time together. They got all of the Sabine men drunk, slaughtered a lot of the men, stole the women, and took them as their wives. So this event is called the Rape of the Sabines. And this was seen as the founding story of Rome. This is like part of their country's founding philosophy. So for a long time, this wasn't seen as a negative story. This was seen as a great triumph that we wouldn't have Rome if not for stealing these women, which sounds insane. And looking back, this is obviously a terrible, terrible event. This sculpture is a good example of Baroque sculpture and Baroque artwork, though. So when we look at Renaissance artwork, everything is very motionless. The David is just standing. Everything is very peaceful. Baroque artwork is always right in that moment of action. There's movement. There's a twist to it. You can see that there's a spiral that goes up in these figures that you can kind of spin around. And you can tell that this is the moment of the height of action. They're not just showing a man preparing to go and steal a woman or a man having already stolen a woman. It is the man taking the woman from the man, from that other man. And that is very typical of Baroque artwork. This is a sculpture by a man named Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the greatest sculptor of the Baroque period. And the name of this sculpture is The Rape of Persephone. And when I say rape, at this time, the word rape meant to abduct or to steal. It also, the implication, though, is also what we now refer to as rape. So this is a mythological story about Persephone, who was abducted by the god of the underworld, Hades, and Persephone's mother was in control of the weather. And so they came, when Persephone was stolen, her mother stopped having good weather. She made the plants die. She made winter. And they had to come to an arrangement that Hades could only have Persephone in the underworld for 3 months out of the year. And Persephone then had to come back to the surface, be reunited with her mother so that her mother wouldn't be sad, so that the plants could grow and the sun would come out. And that's why the winter lasts for 3 months. So those are the 3 months that Persephone is in the underworld with Hades. So that's the story behind this. But the way that it is sculpted is it's so well done. This is sculpted in marble. And when we look at the details of this, we can see just how good Bernini is at making this very soft texture out of stone. Stone is very hard. But when we look at this, the way the fingers push into the skin, it looks very soft. It looks like you could push into it and feel that fleshy texture, which is very difficult to do. Now I want to compare Bernini's sculpture with 2 Renaissance sculptures. All 3 of these are sculptures of the David. They are supposed to be the same person. The one on the left is a sculpture by Donatello. The one in the middle is a sculpture by Michelangelo. And on the right, we have the sculpture by Bernini. These are all 3 sculptures of David. Donatello's David, he seems very young. I said before in a previous video that David is supposed to be about 17 years old. Donatello's David seems much younger than 17. Michelangelo's David in the middle seems maybe in his 20s. And Bernini's David seems more in his like 30s, late 30s. But the main difference that we see is that Donatello's David and Michelangelo's David are very relaxed. They're standing there, they're thinking. Donatello's David, he's standing on the head of Goliath. He has already gone to battle and he has been successful. In Michelangelo's David, he's holding the stone in his hand. He has a slingshot over his shoulder. He's getting ready to go into battle, but he is not yet in battle. In Bernini's David, you get the sense that he is looking at Goliath. He is looking at his enemy. He has the stone in his hand. He has the sling in his hand, and he's about to release that stone. His body is twisted, which is what we're looking for in Baroque sculpture, that he has that spiral as he goes up, and that facial expression is so intense. You can tell he is concentrating, he is ready to take action. This is that moment, the most action-packed moment in the story. Another focus that we're going to see in Baroque art is trying to have lots of different materials and fitting them together in a way that makes sense. And so this is a sculpture in the middle by Bernini called The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. And you can see where it is in this building. This is in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. That it is this marble sculpture, but it's fitted in with this green and red stone. And behind them are these gold bars that come down. And above those gold bars is a window. And what we can't see back in here, on the other side, opposite of the window, is a big gold plate that reflects light so that light bounces off of that like a mirror, then bounces onto these golden bars and into our eyes. So these golden bars look like these rays of light coming down. And so he's really wanting to have this seamless transition from wood to stone to gold and to glass and to light so that everything just seems like it fits together, even though there are a lot of different materials here. This is a close-up of that sculpture, and I want to make sure that you know that this is made out of one solid block of marble. And he's trying to get as many different textures as he can in this. So we have an angel here that looks an awfully lot like Cupid, but we have an angel here that you see the garment on this angel seems very light, like the wind is blowing it. That like it's, even though it's this heavy marble, it feels like if you blew on it, it would ripple. Versus St. Teresa's robe here. This is not Mother Teresa. This is a different saint, St. Teresa. Her robe is very heavy. Those folds are very thick. You get the idea that it wouldn't bend very easily. It has a lot of starch in it. It's like a muslin bag or something. And then you have this third texture here of this cloud that she's on. So the story behind this is that St. Teresa, she was a nun, she was a virgin, And the story goes that she had this experience where she had a vision where she fell asleep and she floated up into the air, and an angel took an arrow and stabbed her with the arrow, but instead of feeling pain, she felt intense pleasure. And that is called the ecstasy of Saint Teresa. And so that's what we're seeing her here. She is floating up in the air in a sleep-like, dreamlike state and feeling pleasure being stabbed by this angel with an arrow. And you can see this cloud here. This stone actually goes back inside the wall and is held up from behind, which is cool because it makes this marble sculpture float. It's just floating up in this space, which is a really neat effect. But something I do want to point out is that this arrow, if we follow where it's pointing, in the story, when she told it, she's stabbed in the heart. She's stabbed in the chest. But when we look at this arrow, it is not pointed at her chest. It is pointed much lower down here, which gives this a little bit more of a sexually suggestive idea to it, a sexually suggestive motion to it. And that could just be, it was a little bit of a mistake. This arrow was pointed the wrong direction. It was not a mistake. It was not a mistake. Just knowing the artwork of this time period, it was not a mistake. That the artist Bernini, he was hinting at the fact that Saint Teresa experiencing this extreme pleasure being penetrated by an arrow is somewhat sexual in nature. So the interior of St. Peter's Basilica has this giant canopy, and this was also carved by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. This is made out of wood, and it's just a magnificent, giant canopy. And these right here, these columns are so typically Baroque. It has that spiral as it goes up, but it kind of this chunky, weird, warped look to it. So Baroque, the word Baroque means irregularly shaped. And the first things that they started calling Baroque were pearls. So pearls, generally, we see them as perfect circles. We like to see circular pearls. But in this time period, other shapes of pearls started to get really popular. So if you would open up a clam or an oyster and you get a pearl out and it's shaped like a dolphin, well, that would have been worth a lot more than a pearl. But the way pearls look when they're shaped a different way, they look kind of globular. They look kind of like a Cheeto. This is essentially like if you were going around collecting Cheetos from Cheeto bags and finding Cheetos that were shaped like different things, and you're like, this one's shaped like a lion, so it's worth a lot more. That's what they were doing, but they were doing that with pearls. And these pearls that had all these different interesting shapes were called Baroque pearls. And then when they started making sculptures like this that look very similar to the way a misshapen pearl looks, that's where this word Baroque of Baroque artwork and Baroque sculpture came from. But you can see this is the interior of St. Peter's Basilica. That's the building that the dome was designed by Michelangelo. And you can see all of these gold bars here and the sculpture that is fitting in. And there's some painted parts in here as well with wood and stone and gold and light and everything bouncing around the space, trying to get this really good seamless transition from one thing to the next. And it's really makes a fantastically beautiful effect. This building here is probably the best example of Baroque architecture. It's called the Church of the Jesu. It's a Jesuit church. And what we see in Baroque architecture is engaged columns instead of standing columns. Engaged columns means they're attached to the wall. They're touching the wall. So you see these columns here, and here there's a column, and these columns down here. They actually are part of the wall. They're not really columns. They're not standing out in front of the wall like you would see in a Roman building or in a Renaissance building. They are a part of that wall. And so it's just a big facade. Again, in Baroque artwork, we see a lot of these spirals and scroll work. And they would also break up this facade by not having these lines go straight across. You can see it starts to come out, and then it juts forward and then goes back, and then forward, and then forward some more, and then back, and then back, and then forward, so that that wall isn't just straight across. It kind of juts out and in and out and in, breaking up those long straight lines. You're not going to see as many long, straight, perfect lines in Baroque architecture. They're going to break up those lines a lot more. But the outside of this building isn't super impressive, but the inside is magnificent. So this is the ceiling on the inside of this building. And you can see that it has this combination of like gold and sculpture and paint. The name of this is The Triumph of the Name of Jesus, and it was painted by Giovanni Battista Gauli. And I'm going to zoom in here. This IHS is supposed to be the name of Jesus right there in the middle. And so you kind of have everyone looking up. It's like the ceiling is opened up and you can look up into the heavens and everyone is surrounding that. You have all of these babies, these what are called putti and cherubs. Some of them are just baby heads with wings, you can see there. Just the overall spirituality of it. But then there's these marble sculptures in here too that are painted to look like they are sculpted in, but this is all painted. All of this is painted. This is a flat ceiling. It's a barreled ceiling, so it's curved, but there is no texture to the ceiling. It's all painted, which is why some of these clouds are able to come out here into the space, but even the shadow of those clouds is painted on there. So this is called trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil. It's a strange Italian term that means to fool the eye. They're trying to trick you into thinking that this looks real. They don't want you to know where the actual sculpture ends and the painting begins. And as we come down this way, we start to see things that are falling from heaven. We see some chimera here, which are like half animal, half people. These are the demons and devils being cast out, going that direction. So this is the same ceiling, it's just a different kind of lighting. It's been edited differently. But this is a good example of what that trompe-l'oeil I'm talking about looks like. When we look at these window wells, it's hard to know what is a sculpture and what is painted. You can see right here, this sculpture goes in front of the window. This is a sculpture. This is actually sculpted. It is actually there. This is painted. That is not an actual sculpture. So this figure and this figure and this figure, the ones that are on the sides of the windows, those are all real sculptures that are up there. Everything else is painted. So, but it does give you this idea, like, so when you look up at it, it looks like all of these sculptures are real because you can tell that some of them are real because as you move across the space, they cover up the window. And it gives this really cool effect where you just don't know where the wall ends and the ceiling begins. The most important painter that we are going to talk about, the painter that defined the Baroque period, is this painter here. His name is Caravaggio. His name was Michelangelo, but he didn't go by Michelangelo because everyone would be like, oh, the other artist is Michelangelo. So he was from the town called Caravaggio. So we went by Michelangelo de Caravaggio. But now we just call him Caravaggio. And he was a terrible human being. I'm just going to start with that. But he was a good painter. And he invented this style of painting. So people that painted like him were called Caravaggisti, which has this dark, murky background with these strong highlighted figures going out of it, where you can see the arm kind of fades back into the shadow. This is again a painting of David, that same figure, holding the head of Goliath. This style of painting is called tenebrism. Tenebrism means murky. So you have these figures coming out of that shadow, that murky background. That's tenebrism or Caravaggisti. And I do want to point out that this is a self-portrait. Caravaggio painted his own face into this image, and it's right here. That is Caravaggio's head with like blood and guts coming out of it, his severed head. And there's a reason that he painted himself as Goliath. Caravaggio got into some trouble. He murdered some people, and so he got kicked out of Rome. So he was a murderer, but an excellent painter. So the church bought a lot of his paintings, and then eventually they're like, "Sorry, Caravaggio, you're too bad of a human being. We're going to exile you." So he got kicked out of Rome and was not allowed to ever come back to Rome. And he always wanted to come back. He always wanted to paint for the church. He always wanted to come back to Rome. So he tried to tell them that he was sorry. So part of that is painting himself as Goliath, as the severed head of Goliath, because if he went back to Rome, he would be beheaded. And so this is his way of saying, I've done my time. It's bad enough just being exiled. Please let me come back. But he never was able to go back to Rome. He was an excellent painter, but always controversial. This is a portrait that he did when he was young, a self-portrait. Again, this is Caravaggio. And this is himself as Bacchus. Bacchus, the god of wine, also called Dionysus. And there are things about this that look a little weird. He looks kind of sick. It's likely that whatever red he used, there was a pink or a red that he used that faded over time. So his lips should have that red pink color, which means that these grapes probably also had that reddish pink color. And a lot of the pinks and reds that were in his flesh aren't there anymore. But he painted himself in this kind of flirty way. And him being Bacchus adds to that. Bacchus was the god of wine, and he was also the god of everything that goes with wine. Drunkenness, debauchery, fornication. The festivals to Dionysus had a lot of inappropriate activities. And that is alluded to in this, that he has these peaches here, the stone fruit, and grapes, and this long thing coming out here that all kind of allude to his sexuality, that he is trying to attract you with this image. This is probably his most famous image, though. He made a lot of these narrative paintings of Christian stories. So this is called The Calling of St. Matthew. And what we see here, they have this person here is Jesus. You can tell he has a very, very thin halo here. If you look closely, you can see that. And so this is supposed to be Jesus when he goes and finds Matthew, who is a tax collector. So these are all tax collectors. They are counting the people's money that they took. And this is him calling Matthew. And if you look at this hand right here, the pose of that hand is one that might look familiar to you. That is the hand that on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with the two hands that are almost touching. It's the hand of Adam, which is showing that this portrayal of Jesus, he's supposed to look like a man. That is showing that he is human. He has that kind of limp pointing hand like Adam. Now, there's a lot of debate as to who he's pointing at. It's hard to tell. You have this line here that gets us in the right direction. It misses this person entirely, so we know he's not pointing at that person. We have this sword that points up to somewhere in here, so one of these three. And then we have this finger pointing here. And it is really hard to tell. Is this finger pointing at this young man here, or is this old man pointing at himself? It's really hard to know. It's hard to know. So it's assumed that he painted that this is Matthew or this is Matthew. According to what time period this would be and how old Matthew was supposed to be, it's likely that the young man is supposed to be Matthew. But that old man is the same model that Caravaggio used for other paintings of Matthew later on in his life. So it could be that both of them are supposed to represent Matthew, that the young man is Matthew, but he also has that model to have continuity in his multiple images of Matthew, so that the old version of Matthew is hinted at in the young version of Matthew. I'm not going to leave this painting on the screen very long. This is called Love Conquers All, and all I want to point out is that these wings are not the white wings that are usually associated with Cupid, that this is very much looks like a painting of Cupid. And I want to point out that this represents the church, this represents music, this represents war, and all of the lines in this point to this young man's genitals. That painting is very uncomfortable to look at. It's designed to be uncomfortable to look at. Caravaggio wanted you to look at that child inappropriately. And I talk about this painting because I want you to understand that Caravaggio was a very, very bad person. It is known, it has been recorded that he did have a very young boy that traveled with him. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that he had a relationship with this young boy, that Caravaggio was a pedophile. We know he was a murderer. And there's a whole lot of evidence to suggest that he was a pedophile. I want to tell the story about the end of Caravaggio's life. It's hard to know if this is a true story or not, but it is the story that has prevailed, and it's a kind of fun one. So he ended up in a place called Malta, and he finally, according to legend, got a letter from Rome saying he could return to Rome. They took all of his belongings, everything he owned, all of his paintings, put them on a boat. They were going to sail in the morning to go to Rome. He was going to finally be able to return and paint for the church. But he got into a bar fight, got put in jail overnight. And when they released him in the morning, he went out to the beach. And when he got there, he saw the ship with all of his belongings sail off on its way to Rome without him. And the story goes that he ran after it and had so much grief that he collapsed on the beach and died. That's the story. So all of his paintings went back to Rome on a ship, but he never did. This is the last painting of Caravaggio that we're going to look at. This is called Judith beheading Holofernes. So this is a Hebrew story about Judith, that the Hebrew people were about to go to war against an enemy, and the enemy king was Holofernes. And the story goes that Judith and her handmaid, who was with her, during the night sneaked over into the enemy camp, went to the tent of the king, and while he was sleeping, Judith cut off his head and took it back to the Hebrew people. And in the morning, when both armies went to the field to go to battle, to go to war, Judith walked out with the head of Holofernes, and it stopped the war from ever happening. So she is this heroine who is known for stopping a war. She killed one man to stop thousands from dying. Now, I want to point out how Caravaggio paints Judith. She is beheading a man, but she doesn't look like she is very powerful. She doesn't look like she is prepared for what she's doing. She looks shocked by what she's doing. She looks fearful of what she's doing. She looks very timid. She doesn't have much power behind her. She doesn't look like she's even positioned to be able to be doing what she's doing. She looks more dainty than she does powerful. She does not seem like this powerful figure. She does not seem like this powerful figure that is stopping a war and taking down a king. She looks very weak. And this plays into something called the male gaze that shows up in artwork throughout Western history, where women are portrayed in the way that men want to view them. That even this powerful woman who is stopping an entire war, who is beheading a king, still looks meek, still looks small, because men don't want to view women as powerful. That was the idea at the time. And so I want to compare this with another painting of the exact same theme. This is also a painting of Judith beheading Holofernes. But this is painted by a female artist named Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia Gentileschi was the model for this image. This is Artemisia here. It is a self-portrait. This Artemisia looks very different. She does not look nearly as frightened. She does not look nearly as weak. She looks powerful. She looks determined. And her handmaid isn't standing to the side waiting for the head. Her handmaid is actively participating. She is holding Holofernes down. Holofernes is fighting back in this one. They didn't just surprise him and cut off his head. In this one, they are overpowering Holofernes. These women are strong, they are powerful, and they are enacting change in the story. This is not typical of what we would see during the Baroque period, the way this would be painted by a man. The way men painted this, usually you would see Judith being much more timid. Artemisia Gentileschi liked to paint powerful women doing powerful things, and she herself was a very powerful woman. This is another painting by Gentileschi, and to really understand this painting, we need to know a little bit about Gentileschi's story. So Gentileschi was trained as an artist, which was not typical. Her father was named Orazio Gentileschi, and he was a painter. And it was not typical for a painter to train their daughter to paint. Normally they would train their son, but his daughter happened to be better at art than his sons were. So he decided, I'm just going to teach my daughter how to paint. He let her be his studio assistant, which is normally how you would start. And then she went through the normal process of the Artist Guild. So the normal process would be that you would become an apprentice under a master painter. You would work in their studio. You would prepare paint for them. You would learn how to do everything from them and eventually work your way up to being a master painter through the guild. And it was typical for you not to study under your own parent because you're always going to get education and see the style of your own parent. So it's good for you to be trained by someone else. So she was trained by an artist called Agostino Tassi. Tassi was a good painter and did train her in painting, but he also then raped her. And he had another man stand guard while he went into the house and he raped Gentileschi. Gentileschi accused him of rape, took him to court, and it was a long, drawn-out court case. And part of that court case, to decide if she was telling the truth or not, they tortured Artemisia. They tortured her. They're like, if you are telling the truth, then we can break your thumbs, and you won't change your story. So they put her in thumb screws, which would mangle your fingers. And she did not change her story. They decided, oh, well, we think she is telling the truth. And so they decided in the court case that, yes, she was raped by Tassi. And they gave him essentially a slap on the wrist. The church loved his painting. So they decided, I don't think he feels bad enough. He was banned from the city. He was exiled for a short period of time before he was able to just come back and paint for the church. And so she was upset. She went through all of this. It was a very public case. She had a lot of ridicule for speaking out against such a pillar of society, Tassi, who was very well connected. And so she went on to paint a lot of images like this. This is called Susanna and the Elders. And the story of Susanna, this is another old Hebrew story. The story of Susanna is that Susanna was in the garden, a private garden, bathing, and two elders from the town, the leaders of the town, watched her bathe. And they went to her and told her that if she doesn't have sex with them, that they are going to tell everyone that they saw her have sex with someone else, even though she was engaged, and destroy her life. She refused, and then they accused her of having sex with this other person. But during the trial, both of these elders were questioned separately. And when they asked them about what happened, they both told different stories. And so it was decided that they were lying about her, and they were both put to death. And so part of what she is alluding to here is that the elders in this story didn't even rape Susanna. They just accused her of being sexually active, and they were put to death. But Agostino Tassi, who did rape Artemisia, had essentially no punishment. So in this painting, this man right here looks a lot like Tassi. This looks a lot like Tassi and the man who stood guard for him. It's very likely that that is what she had in mind when she painted this. And even more so when you look at this painting when it's x-rayed. So a while back, someone decided to x-ray this painting because looking at the texture, it looked like there might be more painting underneath. So when they x-rayed it, it looks like this. This is what the painting looks like underneath. So Artemisia painted this and then later decided to change it. The original painting, they are pulling her hair. She's holding a knife. She's screaming out. This is not the story of Susanna and the Elders. This does not happen in the story of Susanna and the Elders. So when she started this painting, it was about something else. So it's very likely that this painting has to do with her own sexual assault and her own experiences. Why she changed it, we don't know. We don't know why she decided to change it to be safer. It could be that she was told by the Artist Guild that she can't put this out, that she would have some kind of consequence, that this would tarnish Tassi's reputation. It's possible that she decided that it was too violent. It could be that she didn't want to face the consequences of putting this image out. It was too much of an expression of herself, and it wasn't because it was no longer a historical painting. So we don't know the exact reason. But she decided to change it. She made Susanna less aggressive, more gentle, and she made the elders less violent. So this also plays into this idea of the male gaze, that this was altered to be something that would be accepted by men. This version of the painting was more acceptable to be viewed by men. It was less offensive to men. The next artist we're going to talk about is a man named Peter Paul Rubens. And he was a Dutch artist. And he was known for these kinds of figures, these women who were a little bit heavier. The figures that look like this, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as Rubenesque. And that's named after him, after Rubens. So this is his painting of the rape of the Sabines. Again, you can see here we have a Roman soldier. These are two Roman soldiers stealing a couple of women. And look what we have here. We have a cherub. Cherubs always signify that this is a spiritually significant event. This is an approved event. The gods deemed this event appropriate. We have a cherub right here. We have another one right here with this horse. That is his way of saying this was an appropriate event. The gods approved of the Romans stealing these women. This is another painting by Rubens, and this really gets into the role of artists at the time. Artists, as they gained popularity, would move into a lot of different roles. Sometimes they would start to become diplomats. They would sometimes be spies. Even Artemisia, when she was later in life, she became a very popular artist, and she would go and paint different kings. Kings would be like, oh, there's a woman artist, I really want to be painted by her, and she would go and paint their portraits. And when that would happen, they would always be exchanging information. An artist would go paint a foreign king. Well, if you're from Italy and you're going to France to paint a portrait of the French king, then the Italian king is going to be like, hey, bring back information. Because if you're going to be sitting with the king of France for 20 to 30 hours, sometimes 100, 600 hours, then you're going to be talking with the King of France for a long time, building trust and spending a lot of quality time with them. Come back, give me information. And they would pay these artists to bring back information. So they would go and paint the King of France. And the King of France would be like, you're very close with the King of Italy. I will pay you for information about the King of Italy. And so they were often getting paid for all of this information in exchange of ideas. They would also be paid as diplomats, as representatives of their country, as ambassadors. And so sometimes they were playing all of these different roles. And Rubens was also a lawyer. So Rubens was in one of these roles that he did a lot of politics as well as painting. This painting here is called The Arrival of Maria de' Medici. And this depicts Maria de' Medici here. When we talked about Renaissance art, we talked about the Medici family, and sometimes some people pronounce it Medici. The Medici family that hired kids to throw rocks at the statue of David. Well, this is Maria de' Medici from that family. From Florence, from Italy. Here she is arriving in France. This is a Knight of Malta. The Knights of Malta protected people as they traveled overseas. And here we have this messenger to greet her, wearing this robe that has the fleur-de-lis, which is a symbol of France. So this is her arriving in France. Maria de' Medici married the King of France. It was a political marriage. So she was this very, very, very powerful family in Florence, in Italy, and marrying into the royal family of France and merging these two dynasties. Again, we can't just have Maria de' Medici arrive in France off of a boat feeling kind of seasick and looking disheveled. No, she has to be in this magnificent dress with an angel flying in, blowing trumpets, and the sea creatures coming out of the ocean to announce her arrival into the Kingdom of France. The antithesis of Rubens, another artist also painting in France at the time, was Nicolas Poussin. And Poussin, he was the head of the art school, the Royal Academy in France. And he had a different approach to art. He has this romantic view where he believed that everything should be very structured. This is a pastoral landscape. He wanted everything to be able to be read, almost like a book. Everything needed to make sense. This is not a real place, but it is structured. So he has this kind of zigzag that goes back. This line brings you in, it comes over, it zigs back up over this way, and then back this way, and then this way, and then this way, and this way. So you kind of have this zigzag that goes back and brings you into this image. All of these layers, you have this light here, and then this dark shadowed area, and then the light, and then a shadow, and then this light, and then a shadow. It just repeats going back, giving a lot of depth to this image. It's very structured. He believed that line was the most important thing, line and drawing and structure, as opposed to Rubens, who believed that color was the most important thing in painting. And there was a lot of writing back and forth between the two of them and arguing over what is more important, line or color. Rubens ended up being the better artist. He ended up being the more popular and more well-known artist. Color won out over line in this scenario. And really, Rubens, he was just much more prolific as an artist. And part of the reason for that is the way he ran his studio. So we talked a little bit about how you would have a master painter who would take on an apprentice. The way Rubens did it, his paintings were painted by his apprentices. He would make the initial sketch. It would be a smaller painting of where everything goes, what it's going to look like. And then his students, his apprentices, would paint the whole painting, except for hands and faces. Rubens would paint those himself. And then at the end, he would go in and finish the painting. He would make changes, paint it the way he wanted to. But the bulk of the painting process would be done by his apprentices. And the reason he did this is because he was making so much work. And these are big. These are really, really big. His paintings were sometimes 15, 20 feet tall. So he's making these super large paintings, and he's making a lot of them. And for him to be able to do them fast enough, he had to have other people painting on them. And this way he was able to produce a lot of very large paintings very quickly. Now, moving out of Baroque, and that was a little bit of Romantic art. Rubens and Poussin aren't exactly Baroque, but they're in the same time period. But they're more Romantic than they are Baroque, and they're in France. We have moved into France. And now we're going to talk about Rococo. This is King Louis XVI. You can see this is King Louis's robe. It has the fleur-de-lis, which we see a lot in St. Louis, because St. Louis has its connection to France, and it's St. Louis, named after one of the Louis of France. Louis XVI really has a lot going on in this painting. He wants to show you all the cool things he has. His sword is so bejeweled. His high heels are so high and wonderful, so that they can show off his calf muscles that you can see because his tights are so tight. And he really wants you to see his very big hair and all of these wonderful textures and fabrics, which were very, very expensive at the time. This velvet, blue velvet, was a very, very expensive material. And just all of this red, this scarlet fabric as well. Everything here is very luxurious and very rich. This gold thread in here would be real gold. All of the fleur-de-lis, this is all real gold. And he was married to, his mistress was Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette liked simpler things. She actually had a separate little village made for her next to the palace. And these two people lived in this palace, the Palace of Versailles. So the people of France didn't like Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The capital of France was in Paris, and Louis XVI moved it. He moved it to Versailles. He had this palace built, and it has these roads, all of the roads coming out from the palace to kind of represent the arms of the royalty, reaching out to the people to welcome them in. And this is opulent. This house is enormous and so fancy. And they had the royal court, which had a lot of people that just lived there for the entertainment of the king and queen. They had parties all the time. They had all kinds of food. They even had secret passages that went behind the bedrooms and behind all of the rooms, so that they could ring a bell and food could just come out of the wall. So servants would have secret passages that they would go in, so you would never see the servants. And so they would just hand you food out of a little hole in the wall. And they even had fireplaces that the servants would add wood to the fire from behind the fireplace, so you never have to see them. And so there was this big separation between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and the royal court and the people. The people of France did not like them because the people of France were sinking into poverty. France had just lost a war against Britain, which cost a lot of money and cost a lot of resources. And so the people of France were starving. People were dying of starvation. And the royalty of France wanted to get back at Britain by funding the Americans in the Revolutionary War. They were sending funds and supplies and weapons to America to help the revolutionaries to fight against Great Britain, because they were still sour about losing in a war to Great Britain. And the people of France were very upset by this, because they were saying, why are we sending our goods over there when our own people are starving? But the royalty of France didn't care that much. They just went on living their opulent lives in this palace. This was the backyard of the palace. This is the view from the king's bedroom. The carpet in the bedroom was the same pattern as this grass here. So that it's like the bedroom carpet continues out into the garden. So a French garden looks like this. A French garden is very controlled. It's all about controlling nature, making nature look the way you want it to, looking very uniform. It does not look natural at all. This is our creation, not a natural creation. And that's very different from an English garden. An English garden is one that it is very designed and everything is planted and put where it's supposed to be. But the goal is for it to look natural, for it to look like it just grew that way. A French garden, there's nothing that looks natural about this. And it is very controlled. And back behind this was the private hunting grounds of the king. There was just a massive amount of land. He had this fountain put in. This is Apollo's chariot coming up out of the water. He equated himself. He called himself the Sun King. He thought that he had a lot in common with Apollo. He saw himself as part god, part king. And this is the inside of the Palace of Versailles. This is called the Hall of Mirrors. Mirrors were very expensive, and this whole wall here, all of these are all mirrors that match the windows on this side. Windows and glass that large was a brand new technology. They had just figured out how to make glass that big. It was really hard to do, and it was very, very expensive. So this Hall of Mirrors was just the most expensive space that could possibly be built. And it had all of these paintings on the ceilings with these faux frames. It's just an overly expensive space. This is another view of it. You can see it a little bit better. They made this as opulent, as fancy as possible. So when we talk about Rococo artwork is this French 1700s royal art. It is gold and pearl, and everything is just as expensive and fancy as possible. This is the art style of the richest of the rich, of massive wealth. Still today, when you see people who have massive wealth, you start to see Rococo architecture and Rococo furniture and Rococo chandeliers. Rococo is the artwork of the super rich. It is a beautiful space. It's a beautiful building, but it is needlessly expensive. Living this way did not end well for King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The people were so upset that it started the French Revolution. The French people in Paris, they took over the armory. They tore down the Bastille. So they broke all of the political prisoners out of prison, and they were able to take all of the guns and ammunition of the state of France. So they took over Paris. And once they did that, they were able to take France from the royal family. So they actually stormed the Palace of Versailles and kidnapped the king and queen, took them to Paris, and cut off their heads with the guillotine. So Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were both beheaded by the people of France. Rococo painting has similarities to Rococo architecture. It is frivolous. It's fun. It's very lighthearted. You're not going to see serious Rococo paintings. This is a young girl reading by an artist named Fragonard. And you see these pinks and pastel yellows and teals that come out. A lot of this artwork depicts leisure, relaxing. Probably the most famous Rococo painting is The Swing. This is also by Fragonard. This was a very common pastime for people in the royal court in France at the time to go off into the woods and play around, have fun. You saw this in other places as well. There's actually a book about St. Louis called The Rose of Old St. Louis that's written about the 1700s in St. Louis and talked about people going out into the woods and playing and having picnics. Well, this was common in the 1700s in St. Louis within a certain group of people, and also very common here in France. So this is the swing. This woman is on a swing here. There's a man back behind her pulling these ropes that are helping her swing back and forth. You have a sculpture of a little angel here on the side that has his finger up like a shh, don't tell. And then down here we have a man in the bushes. Looking up her skirt. And you kind of get the idea that she knows that that man is there. She looks like she might actually be looking down at him. She kicked her shoe off. It seems like maybe she's intentionally kicking her leg up to give him a view. Her chaperone back here, we don't know if that's her husband or her father or just someone that went out in the woods to keep track of her, to make sure she doesn't get lost or stolen. In any case, he is not aware of the man in the bushes. But it's images like this. This is very typical for Rococo artwork. It has the pinks and the teals, and it's light, and it's a little bit funny. It's playful. It's not too serious. And that's what the royalty of the 1700s were trying to do. They didn't want to be serious. They wanted to laugh and play and eat cake all day. In fact, Marie Antoinette had her own little village built near the Palace of Versailles with cute cottages and shops, like a whole village. And they hired people to go to the village and pretend to be villagers, to pretend that Marie Antoinette wasn't royalty, so she could go to this village and just go and buy some food and relax and hang out in the village with the fake villagers so that she didn't have to feel like royalty when she was there. They hired people to pretend that she was just a villager when she was there. She's not the only person to ever do this. I know Michael Jackson did this once. He rented a grocery store and hired people to pretend that he wasn't Michael Jackson so that he could just go shopping at a grocery store and feel like he was the same as everyone else. That they actually paid people to treat him like a normal person and not like Michael Jackson. So there is like, I can understand that, like, not wanting to feel different all the time. But there is something strange about having an entire village built and villagers hired so you can go to it when half of your country is starving to death. So there was a reason that people were upset with them. That's the end of this video about Baroque and Rococo art, and a little bit of romantic art thrown in there. I know that some of these topics are very, very heavy. It's important to me not to gloss over these topics when we talk about these artists, because I don't want to present these artists without giving you the full picture. Thank you for watching.